You're just like your father, weak and nosy." The words hit harder than the shove. 11-year-old Noah stumbled backward, dirt and pine needles slipping under his boots as the edge of the cliff loomed behind him. The wind stung his face, but it was nothing compared to the sting in his chest. His uncle's eyes, once cold and calculating, now burned with something darker, desperation. Martin had brought him here under the pretense of a hike, just a day out in the woods, like they used to do when Noah's dad was alive. But halfway through the trail, something had changed. The path veered off into silence, and Martin's questions stopped being friendly. When Noah refused to hand over the USB drive he'd found hidden in the old toolbox, one that contained financial records, property documents, and even a will Noah had never seen, his uncle's smile vanished. Now Martin stood with clenched fists and shaking shoulders, towering over the boy. "You had no right going through my things," he growled. "You think you're smarter than me? You think anyone's going to listen to a kid?" Noah's throat tightened, but he held his ground. "Dad left that file," he said, barely more than a whisper. "Not for you, for me." A pulse flickered in Martin's neck. Then he stepped forward, and Noah's heel caught on a stone. He stumbled. One more step back, and a flash of black and tan fur tore through the trees. A massive German shepherd burst into the clearing, a low growl rising in his throat like distant thunder. His name was Ranger, the dog Noah hadn't seen in nearly a year, the one they'd all assumed had run off after the accident, after Noah's father died under suspicious circumstances in a so-called hiking fall of his own. But here he was, and his eyes were locked on Martin. The man barely had time to curse before Ranger lunged, not with teeth, not with blood, but with full weight slamming into Martin's side. The force was enough to knock him off balance, tumbling him backward into the underbrush, away from the ledge. Noah dropped to his knees, heart pounding in his ears, staring at the dog that now stood between him and the man who had just tried to kill him. Martin scrambled to his feet, red-faced and gasping. "You've got to be kidding me," he spat. "That mutt should have died with your old man," Ranger growled, low and guttural, lips twitching back just enough to show his teeth. Noah didn't know how or why the dog had returned, but he knew one thing. This wasn't a coincidence, and this time, he wasn't alone. Martin stood in the underbrush, face twisted in disbelief, brushing pine needles from his coat as his eyes darted between Noah and the German shepherd now guarding him like a soldier on duty. For a brief moment, the forest stilled. The only sound was the sharp exhale of winter wind moving through the pines and the soft crunch of Ranger's paws as he shifted forward slightly, never looking away from the man who had tried to end it all with one shove. Martin's hands twitched at his sides. Noah could see it clearly. He was weighing his chances. But Ranger wasn't bluffing. His body was rigid, coiled like a spring, a warning vibrating in every tense muscle. The man had power once, but now it belonged to the dog. Noah's knees ached against the rocky soil, but he stayed down, stunned by how fast it had all unraveled. 1 second, his life had hung off a ledge, literally, and the next, Ranger, the dog they believed had disappeared for good, had come charging out of nowhere like a ghost from his father's past, and somehow, impossibly, just in time, Martin raised his hand slowly, a forced calm in his voice. "Let's all just relax," he said, edging backward. "No harm done." But Noah didn't move. His heart still pounded in his ears, a chaotic drumbeat of fear and fury. "You tried to kill me," he said, and his voice cracked. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of it all finally breaking loose. "Just like you killed my dad." Martin's eyes narrowed. "Just a fraction." "That's a serious accusation, Noah. One that could ruin lives. Yours," Noah snapped. "And don't pretend you care." There was a flicker of hesitation. Then the mask dropped. Martin's voice dropped to a snarl. "Your dad was a fool. He had everything and wasted it on principles and pipe dreams. He thought that land mattered more than profit. He thought raising you right made up for being weak." Ranger barked once, short and sharp, and Martin flinched. "I found his notes," Noah said, pushing himself up slowly. His hands were trembling, but his eyes didn't leave his uncle. "Everything he documented. You were stealing from him, selling parcels of the farm under the table. And when he found out, you made sure he didn't live long enough to report it." Martin sneered, but he didn't deny it. "You think the cops are going to listen to you? A kid? What proof do you even have?" Noah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal USB drive. This, for the first time, Real panic flickered in Martin's face. "That doesn't belong to you." "It belonged to my dad," Noah said. "He hid it in his toolbox. I didn't even know what it was until Ranger found it." Martin stared, stunned. "The dog?" Noah nodded. "He dug it out, buried in the back shed. He never forgot." The moment cracked, and Martin bolted, turned and sprinted through the trees, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to disappear into the woods before the boy could get to help. But he hadn't counted on Ranger. With terrifying speed, the shepherd leapt forward, weaving through the trees like a shadow. Martin didn't even make it 50 feet before the dog slammed into his legs, sending him sprawling face first into the frozen dirt. He screamed and scrambled, but it was useless. Ranger stood on his chest, growling low, his eyes locked with unwavering focus. This time, there would be no escape. Noah ran to catch up, heart in his throat, but relief washed over him the moment he saw Martin pinned and helpless beneath the dog. He reached for his phone with shaking hands and dialed David, the local sheriff and his father's oldest friend. He didn't even have to explain. One look at the GPS pin and the tension in Noah's voice was enough. Within minutes, flashing lights lit up the edge of the trail. Officers rushed in with caution, guns holstered, but hands ready. Noah called Ranger back with a single word, and to their amazement, the dog obeyed instantly, trotting back to Noah's side and sitting, panting, proud. Martin was cuffed without resistance, though his mouth didn't stop moving, rambling about setups, misunderstandings, conspiracies. But the USB told a different story. It contained records of money laundering, secret land sales, bribes, and audio files of conversations between Martin and buyers, many of whom were already under investigation. It wasn't just theft, it was a network, and Noah's father had uncovered it all, only to die before he could expose the truth. The arrest made local headlines. Sheriff's son's mysterious death, solved by dog and boy, wasn't just a title, it was a symbol of justice delayed, but not denied, of loyalty that outlasted death. That night, Noah sat beside Ranger on the farmhouse porch. The sky was clear, and the stars blinked above like quiet witnesses to all that had happened. The barn light glowed, faintly in the distance, and the fields, his father's fields, rested under the weight of winter, waiting for spring. "Thank you," Noah whispered, scratching behind Ranger's ears. The dog leaned into his hand with a soft whine, his tail thumping once against the porch wood. For the first time since his dad's death, Noah didn't feel like a boy stranded in grief. He felt like someone standing at the edge of a story, not one that ended with a fall, but one that began with a climb back up. And this time, he wouldn't be climbing alone. The wind howled through the ravine as Noah clutched his ribs and staggered. Behind Ranger, his breath sharp and ragged with pain. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes swirling around them like ashes from some dying fire. Every step hurt. His ankle was bruised, his hands numb, but he kept moving because Ranger refused to slow down. The dog's body moved with a desperate urgency, every muscle taut, as if he knew something terrible was about to happen if they didn't reach help in time. Noah glanced over his shoulder once. The trees behind them stood still, but he knew better than to believe they were alone. Martin was somewhere out there, and if the look in his uncle's eyes before he ran off meant anything, he wasn't going to let this end quietly. Not now that the truth was so close to coming out. A flicker of light in the distance gave Noah hope. Through the trees, just barely visible beyond the ridge, he could make out the faint orange glow of a cabin window. Ranger barked once, short, urgent, and picked up speed, weaving through the trees like he knew the way by heart. Noah followed, limping, teeth clenched, refusing to let exhaustion win. He didn't even know who lived in that cabin, but at this point, it didn't matter. They just needed safety. A phone, a door that locked. When they reached the clearing, Ranger stopped and turned to wait. His breath steamed in the cold, and his ears twitched at every sound. The cabin looked old, but solid. There was a chimney with smoke curling up, and behind the frosted glass window, shadows moved. Noah raised a shaking hand and knocked on the wooden door. For a second, nothing. Then the latch lifted, and the door creaked open to reveal an older woman wrapped in a thick wool shawl, eyes wide behind fogged-up glasses. "Noah," she breathed, and then her hand flew to her mouth. "Dear Lord, what happened?" It took him a moment to recognize her. Miss Lorna, his father's childhood neighbor. She used to bring jars of blackberry jam every winter before her arthritis made the climb too hard. "I need help," he croaked. "Please." She stepped aside without Hesitation. "Come in, child, quick." The warmth hit him like a wave, stinging his skin as the cold gave way to heat. He stumbled inside, and Ranger followed without invitation, pacing once around the room before settling near the door like a sentinel. Miss Lorna helped Noah to a seat near the fireplace and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "I'll call the sheriff," she said, already reaching for the landline. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Noah shook his head. "Worse. My uncle tried to kill me." Her hand froze mid-dial. "What?" He told her everything. The land dispute, his father's death, the argument at the cliff, the shove, how Ranger came out of nowhere, how he'd barely survived the fall. He didn't even realize he was crying, until Miss Lorna pressed a warm hand against his cheek. "You're safe now," she whispered, but her eyes flicked toward the window. For now, as she spoke to the sheriff, giving directions, her voice low and urgent, Noah sat silently, clutching the memory stick still hidden in his coat. His father's last truth, the evidence that could finally expose Martin for what he was, but he didn't feel safe. Not yet. Because outside, in the snow-covered trees, Martin was still moving. Back in the woods, Martin's boots crunched through the snow as he cursed under his breath. The kid should have been dead. He had made sure of it. No witnesses, no questions. That was the plan. But somehow that damn dog had ruined everything. Just like its owner. He hadn't come this far to be undone by a mutt and a brat with a bleeding nose. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he spotted the cabin. Small, dimly lit, and too familiar. That old hag Lorna, of course. She'd always been too close to the family, too nosy. He squinted and saw movement inside. The boy and the dog. Martin slipped the pistol from his coat pocket. Inside, Noah suddenly stiffened. Ranger stood up slowly, ears perked, body rigid. Miss Lorna noticed. "What's wrong?" Ranger growled. And then, before anyone could speak, the front window shattered. Noah dropped to the floor as glass exploded inward. Miss Lorna screamed. Ranger lunged, and from the darkness, Martin burst into the room, gun raised, eyes wild. "Give me the drive!" he roared. Noah crawled behind the armchair, heart pounding. The USB burned in his hand. He knew this was the end if he didn't do something now. But then, Ranger moved. The dog launched himself across the room, slamming into Martin with such force that the gun clattered to the ground. They crashed into a table, wood splintering. Martin shouted and swung, trying to hit the shepherd, but Ranger was relentless, snapping, snarling, blocking every move. Miss Lorna reached for the shotgun behind her door, the one her husband had kept for bears. Before Martin could recover, she raised it and said firmly, "Get away from that boy." Martin turned, stunned. The sheriff's sirens cut through the night. Moments later, the front yard filled with flashing red and blue. The air outside was thick with sirens, cold wind, and the crunch of boots as deputies surrounded the cabin. Noah barely dared to move, huddled beside the fireplace with Ranger planted firmly in front of him, fur bristling, eyes locked on the man who had haunted his family for years. Martin's breathing was ragged, but he froze when the red and blue lights flooded through the broken window and spilled across the floor like a warning from the universe itself. Sheriff Colton was the first to burst through the door, his rifle raised, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Drop whatever weapon you've got left, Martin. Hands where I can see them. Now." Martin's shoulders twitched, torn between surrender and one last reckless move. But with Ranger snarling just inches away and a shotgun barrel still pointed from Miss Lorna's trembling hands, he did the only thing he could. He raised both arms slowly and stepped back. "That dog is insane," Martin spat, backing into the wall. "You people don't know what you're dealing with." "No," Colton said coldly, cuffing his wrists behind his back. "We finally do, and you're done lying your way out of it." Noah watched in disbelief as they dragged his uncle out, the front door and into the snow, flanked by 2 deputies. It felt unreal, like the nightmare was finally cracking open to let in daylight. But the tension in his chest didn't disappear. Not yet. He still hadn't said a word about the memory. "Stick." Ranger padded back to his side and sat quietly, watching the door, as if expecting Martin to break free and come charging back. Miss Lorna sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her face pale but composed, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. Sheriff Colton turned to Noah, kneeling beside him. "You all right, kid? You hurt?" I'm fine," Noah said quietly. "But there's something you need to see." He pulled the memory stick from his coat and handed it over. It felt heavier than before, like it contained not just files, but the truth his father had died protecting. Colton took it with a frown and gestured to one of his deputies. "Get this to the station. Secure system. ASAP." Ranger rested his head gently on Noah's lap. It was the first time that night the boy had truly felt safe. Later, at the sheriff's office, Noah sat under a warm blanket with a cup of cocoa while Colton reviewed the decrypted contents. The files were damning. Audio recordings of Martin blackmailing land surveyors, fake deeds, a forged signature on Noah's father's final will, documents showing bribes paid to cover up a failed inspection on the very cliff trail where the accident happened. Colton slammed the file shut. "This isn't just attempted murder. This is years of fraud and manipulation. Your dad was onto him, wasn't he?" Noah nodded. "That's why Martin hated me. I was too much like him." "Smart," the sheriff said, "and brave. You saved your own life getting that to us." But Noah shook his head. "I didn't save anything. Ranger did." Colton smiled slightly. "Then maybe it's time we figure out where that dog really came from." A few days later, everything changed. Martin was held without bail. News of the arrest spread like wildfire across the county, reopening wounds that had been festering in silence for years. People who had once been scared to speak up now came forward. Former employees, neighbors, even a retired vet who'd once helped patch up bruises on Noah's arm. The truth, at long last, had a voice, and so did Ranger. Colton had the dog scanned for a chip, and to everyone's surprise, one came back, but not from a shelter, not even from this state. Ranger, it turned out, had been part of a now-defunct military canine unit. He'd been declared too aggressive for further deployment and had vanished from the registry years ago. But someone had given him a second chance, and somehow, fate had led him to Noah. "They say dogs have a sense for danger," Miss Lorna said softly as she and Noah watched Ranger chase snowflakes in the backyard. But that one, he knew more than danger. He knew loyalty, like he'd been waiting for someone to need him again. Noah watched the dog roll in the snow, paws in the air, no longer the tense guardian from that night. He was waiting for family. As spring arrived, Noah stood in court and read a victim statement that silenced the room. His voice didn't shake, even when he mentioned the cliff, the shove, the betrayal. He stood tall, not as the scared boy Martin thought he could silence, but as his father's son, a survivor, a fighter, a protector, just like Ranger. Outside the courthouse, news cameras clicked and strangers whispered, but Noah didn't care. All he wanted was to go home, back to the hills, back to the trees, back to where the snow still remembered every paw print. He knelt beside Ranger, scratched behind his ear, and said quietly, "Let's go home." Ranger wagged his tail once and led the way. The courtroom was silent, so still that even the ticking of the old wall clock sounded like thunder. Noah sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly in his lap, while the judge flipped through a thick folder of evidence, pages that had taken months of courage to bring to light. Ranger sat beside him, tail curled neatly, ears twitching at every creak and shuffle behind them. The courtroom allowed it, just this once. After everything Ranger had done, no one argued. Martin stood shackled, wearing a suit that couldn't hide his anger. His once confident smirk had eroded with each damning testimony, each piece of evidence that peeled back the layers of his lies. His lawyer had long since stopped trying to argue his innocence. Now it was just about saving face, but there wasn't much left to save. Judge Halberd looked up, glasses lowered on his nose. "This court has reviewed all evidence, including the recovered documents, digital recordings, and the official accident reconstruction analysis. The injuries sustained by the victim, the motive established through fraudulent land transfers, and the eyewitness testimony from the boy himself, all align to prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this was not an accident. It was a calculated attempt to silence a child who stood in the way of greed." A murmur moved through the room. Martin shifted, visibly sweating. The judge continued, voice heavy. "For the charges of attempted murder, fraud, falsification of documents, and obstruction of justice, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. Sentencing will follow. Court is adjourned." The gavel dropped with a hollow echo. The sound rang through Noah's chest like a bell announcing the end of a long, brutal winter. He didn't cheer, didn't cry. He just breathed, for the first time in what felt like years, a full breath. without fear. Reporters tried to approach, but Sheriff Colton stepped in, holding them back with a simple shake of his head. "Let the kid be," he said. Outside the courthouse, the air was fresh, warmer than usual for early spring. Noah and Ranger walked together down the courthouse steps, flanked by Miss Lorna and a quiet wave of townsfolk who had once looked the other way, and now nodded at him with something like remorse, or respect, maybe both. Back on the farm, the snow had melted into soft mud and green shoots. The broken fence at the edge of the cliff trail had been rebuilt, stronger this time, with a new warning sign and a sturdy rail. Noah stood at its edge, watching the horizon where the sun dipped low and golden behind the trees. Ranger stood beside him, silent but watchful. "I still remember the fall," Noah whispered. "The air, the cold, how fast everything went." "Dark," Ranger nudged his side gently as if to say, "But you didn't fall alone." "I know," Noah murmured. "You jumped after me. You didn't even think twice." The memories came in waves, the pain, the fear, the warmth of Ranger's body shielding him. And somehow, what hurt the most wasn't the fall or the betrayal. It was the silence afterward. The silence that made him believe for a while that no one would come. That he wasn't worth saving, but someone did come. A dog with a battered ear and soldier's instincts. A companion who didn't care about paperwork or bloodlines or property rights. Ranger had seen a boy crying in the snow and decided that was enough. Miss Lorna joined them, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa and a small folded note. "Found this tucked into one of your dad's old hunting journals," she said. "Thought you might want to see it." Noah opened the note. The paper yellowed and soft at the edges. The handwriting was his father's. "If anything ever happens to me, don't let fear make you small. You were born with fire in your chest, Noah. Don't let anyone put it out. Trust what you know is right, even if you stand alone." His breath caught. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it into his coat pocket like a treasure. "I'm not alone anymore," he whispered. Later that week, a memorial was held for Noah's father. Not a funeral, he'd already had one, but something more real, more complete. People came from all over town, bringing stories, photos, apologies. Noah stood on a wooden stage under a tent of soft string lights, Ranger lying at his feet. "I used to think justice was about revenge," Noah said to the crowd. "About making someone pay. But it's not. It's about truth. And sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes someone unexpected to help you find it." He looked down at Ranger. "This dog didn't just save me. He reminded me that even when you've lost everything, family, safety, even your voice, you still have a choice. You can give up, or you can fight back, quietly, bravely, until someone hears you." Applause rippled through the tent. Some wept. Others nodded silently. Ranger simply wagged his tail once and laid his head back down, eyes closing as if the weight had finally lifted. The ceremony ended with candles released down the river, one for every year Noah had spent in silence. He watched them float, tiny, stars in dark water, carrying grief and memory and peace all at once. That night, as they returned home, Miss Lorna stood in the doorway with an envelope in her hand. "What's that?" Noah asked. "Letter from a retired sergeant," she replied. "Says he thinks Ranger might be one of the K9s from his old unit. Wants to come meet him. Says they lost track of him years ago during transport. No record of where he went next." Noah looked at Ranger, who tilted his head in curiosity. "You ready to find out where you came from?" he asked softly. Ranger let out a quiet bark and wagged his tail, and as the moon rose over the quiet hills, the house finally felt full again. Not because it had all the answers, but because it had something better. Hope, family, and a second chance.